everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. You know how sometimes the world feels like it's spinning a little too fast? Well, today we're going to try to find some solid ground amidst all that chaos.
Sounds like a plan.
We're diving into a talk by J. Krishnamurti from way back in 1975.
Krishnamurti. He always has a way of cutting through the noise.
He really does.
Oh.
And in this talk, he tackles this idea of thought and action, especially in a world that can feel pretty chaotic.
I can see why that would be relevant today. It feels like uncertainty is the only constant these days.
Right. And what's so fascinating is that Krishnamurti was speaking during a time that wasn't so different from our own. The Cold War, social revolutions, technology changing everything.
Definitely a time of massive global shifts, kind of like what we're experiencing now.
Exactly. So in this talk, Krishnamurti throws out this question that really stopped me in my tracks. He asks, can thought, the very thing that's created so many problems for humanity, actually be the solution?
It's a provocative question,
Yeah.
for sure. Makes you wonder, how can something that's caused so much trouble also be the answer?
Right. It's like trying to put out a fire with gasoline.
Well, that's the paradox Krishnamurti's getting at. He's not saying thought is inherently bad. In fact, he argues that pretty much everything around us, our institutions, our beliefs, even the conflicts we see in the world are all products of thought.
So thought is powerful. It shapes our reality.
Absolutely. But Krishnamurti's point is that thought operates within certain limits, and understanding those limits is crucial if we want to move beyond the problems it creates.
He even has this one quote that really stuck with me. He says, thought has created the technological world, and thought has also created the division between you and me.
Yes, I remember that one. It's like he's saying thought can connect us, but it can also build walls between us.
That's exactly it.
Yeah.
So we're connected by technology, but also divided by our beliefs, opinions, all those things our thoughts create.
Precisely. Krishnamurti is pointing to the dualistic nature of thought, how it creates separation, categories, and us versus them mentality.
And it's from that division that a lot of conflict and disorder arise.
Exactly. And it seems like that division is everywhere these days.
It really does. So if thought is both the problem and potentially the solution, where do we even begin to unravel this? Especially if we're trying to figure out how to act in a way that doesn't just keep feeding these cycles of conflict and confusion.
Well, Krishnamurti suggests that a good starting point is to understand what he calls the illusion of the me.
The illusion of the me, what does that even mean?
He's not saying that you and I don't exist, but rather that the me, as we usually experience it, this feeling of being a separate self, is actually a construct of thought.
Okay, I think I'm starting to see where this is going. So you're
Oh.
saying this feeling of I, me, mine, that's all created by thought.
That's what Krishnamurti is suggesting, is this constructed sense of self that he believes leads to a lot of our problems.
It makes you stop and think about how often we operate from that place of me first, you know? It colors how we see the world, how we react to things, pretty much everything.
It's incredibly pervasive. And according to Krishnamurti, when we act from this limited sense of self, it often leads to self-centered actions and further division.
It's like we're constantly trying to protect and promote this idea of ourselves, even if it means putting others down or ignoring their needs.
That's a good way to put it. Krishnamurti gives this example of a husband observing his wife through the lens of an image created by thought.
Okay, so he's already made up his mind about who she is, who he thinks she is, and that's how he sees her.
Precisely. He's not truly seeing her, he's seeing his image of her. And that creates distance, even when they're physically close.
It makes me wonder how often we do that in our own relationships. We interact with people based on our preconceived ideas about them, not who they actually are.
That's the danger of this me-centered perspective. It prevents us from seeing things clearly, from truly connecting with others.
It's like we're living in our own little thought bubbles. Okay, so we're starting to see how thought can be limited and how this sense of me might not be as solid as we think it is. But where do we go from there?
Well, Krishnamurti then asks this really interesting question. Can you observe disorder without the observer? It's a real head-scratcher.
It is. What do you think he means by that?
He's getting at the idea that even when we try to move away from disorder, if we're doing it from the perspective of a separate me trying to fix things, we're still caught in the same trap.
So it's not about trying to fix the problem from the outside, but recognizing that we are part of the problem.
Exactly. We can't separate ourselves from the disorder and then try to solve it. It's like trying to clean a dirty window from the inside. You're still going to see the smudges.
That's a good analogy. It's about seeing ourselves as part of the mess, not standing apart from it and judging it.
And this can be a tricky thing to do because it requires a real shift in perspective.
It's like turning the lens inward, right? Instead of looking outward for the problem, we have to look at ourselves.
Exactly. And to illustrate this point, Krishnamurti uses the example of violence. He says that even labeling a feeling as violent can actually perpetuate that violence.
Oh, wow. That's interesting because by naming it, judging it, we're giving it more power.
In a way, yes.
Hmm.
By creating this separation between me and this bad feeling, we're actually strengthening the very thing we're trying to avoid.
It's like pushing against something only makes it push back harder. So how do we break free from this cycle? If labeling and judging isn't the answer, what is?
Krishnamurti emphasizes the power of perception. He suggests that clear perception, seeing things as they are without the interference of thought or the separate observer, can actually lead to a more harmonious way of being.
He uses this really beautiful analogy about observing a mountain. He says, when I observe without the word the mountain I see, there is a perception of that beauty entirely, and there comes a passion out of that. It's about experiencing things directly, without the filters of thought.
And that applies not just to nature, but to our relationships with other people as well. Imagine what it would be like to observe another person without any preconceived image or judgment.
It would definitely change things. But honestly, I think for a lot of us, that might feel like a void at first, like a sense of emptiness. If we strip away all the stories and meanings we've created with our thoughts, what's left? It can be kind of scary to think about.
That feeling of emptiness is natural.
Mm.
It arises when we begin to let go of the illusions and meanings that thought has created. But Krishnamurti suggests that this void isn't something to fear. It's actually a space where something new can emerge, a state of being where life itself has meaning, free from the limitations of thought.
Okay, I'm starting to get a glimpse of what he's pointing at. So we're starting to see the limitations of thought, the illusion of the separate me, and the potential of this different kind of perception. But there's still this big piece of the puzzle that Krishnamurti brings up. He talks a lot about fear and how it shapes our lives.
Fear is definitely a powerful force, perhaps even more powerful than the gods or destiny we often attribute our actions to.
And it seems like it can take so many forms, right? The fear of physical danger, the fear of failure, the fear of not being good enough. It's almost like it's lurking everywhere.
It's true. And Krishnamurti suggests that fear is often the underlying motivation for our actions, even when we think we're acting out of love or ambition or something seemingly positive.
So even our best intentions can be clouded by fear.
That's the idea. And that's where things get really interesting. Because if fear is often driving the show, then it's preventing us from taking what Krishnamurti calls right action. And that's what we'll be exploring in the next part of our deep dive.
I'm ready to dive deeper. This is getting good.
Welcome back. Last time when we were talking about the me as an illusion, it was almost like a sense of relief, like taking off a heavy backpack, but bringing fear into the mix. Well, it feels a little heavier, a little scarier, to be honest.
Yeah. It's kind of like we opened Pandora's box a little bit.
Yeah,
But I guess that's part of the journey, right? Facing those uncomfortable truths.
it is. And Krishna wouldn't have it any other way. He wouldn't want us to shy away from these difficult topics. He actually suggests that facing fear head-on, understanding its nature, is essential if we want to break free from its grip.
Okay, so how do we do that? How do we even begin to understand something that feels so primal, so deeply ingrained in us?
Well, maybe we should start by clarifying what Krishnamurti means by right action, because that's what he sees fear as an obstacle to.
Right, we kind of glossed over that last time. So what does he mean by right action?
It's not about following a set of rules or dogmas or anything like that. For Krishnamurti, right action is about acting from a place of clarity, intelligence, and compassion, free from the distortions of our conditioning and fears.
So it's not so much about what we do, but why we do it, the motivation behind our actions.
Exactly. And Krishnamurti's point is that fear often clouds our motivations. It leads us to act in ways that are self-serving or even harmful, even when we think we're doing the right thing.
Okay, so how does that actually play out in our lives? Can you give us an example of how fear gets in the way of this right action?
Sure. Well, think about all the different forms fear can take. There's the obvious fear of physical harm, the kind that keeps us safe from danger.
Like looking both ways before crossing the street, or not jumping out of a perfectly good airplane.
Right, those basic survival instincts. But then there's the fear of psychological pain, the fear of rejection, of not being loved or accepted. Those could be pretty powerful too.
Oh, tell me about it. I think we all know what it feels like to want to fit in, to please others, all because we're afraid of being judged or left out. Is that what Krishnamurti would consider a wrong action?
Not necessarily. It's
Huh.
more about understanding the motivation behind those actions. If we're constantly seeking approval or validation from others out of fear, then yeah, that's probably not coming from a place of right action.
Because it's rooted in insecurity, a need to maintain a certain image, instead of just being ourselves.
Precisely. It's not so much about judging the actions as right or wrong, but rather becoming aware of the underlying fears that shape our behavior.
I'm starting to see how subtle this is. Like, we have to become detectives of our own minds, trying to uncover those hidden motives.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
And it's not easy work, but it's the path to freedom, according to Krishnamurti.
Are there other types of fear that he talks about, besides the fear of physical and emotional pain?
He also talks about the fear of the unknown, of uncertainty. You know, as humans, we like to cling to our beliefs, our routines, even our suffering, because it feels familiar, predictable. It gives us a sense of security in a world that can feel pretty chaotic.
It's like that old saying, better the devil you know than the devil you don't. But sometimes that keeps us stuck in unhealthy patterns, right?
Exactly. And then, of course, there's the big one, the fear of death, the ultimate unknown.
Yeah, that one's a doozy. We spend our whole lives building things up, careers, relationships, all this stuff. And then it's like, wait, what happens next? No wonder that fear can be so overwhelming. Does Krishnamurti offer any insights into dealing with that one?
He does. He suggests that the fear of death is often amplified by our attachment to this illusion of the me, to this idea that there's this separate self that's going to cease to exist.
So if we can start to see through that illusion, if we can understand that the me is not who we really are, then maybe that fear starts to loosen its grip.
That's the direction he points us in. It's not about denying death or pretending it doesn't exist, but about shifting our perspective on who we are in relation to this inevitable process. It's about realizing that we're not just this isolated, separate self. We're part of something much larger, something that continues even after this physical body dies.
I can see how that would be comforting, in a way, to know that we're not just these isolated beings, but part of a greater whole.
Exactly. And that's where true freedom from fear can begin, when we start to loosen the grip on that separate sense of self. Because the more we identify with that me, the more we feel a sense of separation and vulnerability, and the more likely we are to experience fear.
It's like we're constantly comparing ourselves to others, competing, worrying about what we have or don't have, who loves us or doesn't love us. It's exhausting.
It is, and it's a recipe for a whole lot of fear.
Mm.
But Krishnamurti suggests that there's another way, a way to live that's not driven by that constant fear and insecurity.
Okay, I'm intrigued. So how do we get there? How do we start to untangle ourselves from this web of fear that we've woven?
Krishnamurti suggests we start by simply observing, not judging ourselves, not trying to analyze our fears or get rid of them, just paying attention to them with a sense of curiosity and openness.
It's like becoming a scientist of our own minds, right? Observing the fear without getting caught up in the story it's telling us.
Exactly. And as we observe, as we become more aware of how fear arises and how it influences our thoughts and actions, something interesting starts to happen.
What's that? I'm on the edge of my seat.
We start to see that fear is often linked to thought, to that sense of a separate me that we've been talking about.
You mean the more we identify with that me, the more afraid we're likely to be?
Precisely. Because if we believe we were this isolated, vulnerable self, then of course we're going to feel afraid. We're going to feel threatened by anything that challenges our sense of security or well-being.
So it all comes back to that illusion of the separate self, the story that we create with our thoughts, and the fear that arises from that story.
Exactly. And that's why Krishnamurti suggests that true freedom from fear begins with understanding that this sense of me, this isolated self, is an illusion.
Okay, I'm starting to see the connections here. The limitations of thought, the illusion of the me, the fear that arises from that illusion, it's all interconnected.
It is. And that's why it's so important to understand the nature of thought. Because if thought has created the problem, then maybe thinking differently is the key to the solution.
This is giving me a lot to think about, and I'm sure our listeners are feeling the same way. So how do we start thinking differently? How do we move from a place of fear to a place of freedom? That's what I'm really curious about.
And that's exactly what we'll be exploring in the final part of our deep dive.
Okay.
So stay tuned.
Well, here we are again, back for the final part of our deep dive into Krishnamurti's ideas about thought, fear, and that tricky illusion of the me.
It's been quite a journey, hasn't it?
It really has. Challenging at times, but also, I don't know, kind of liberating. Like maybe there's a way out of this fear that we've been talking about.
That's the thing about Krishnamurti. He doesn't just point out the problem. He always points towards a solution. And in this case, the solution, or at least the starting point, lies in understanding the nature of thought itself.
Okay, but how do we actually do that? How do we move from being trapped by fear to, well, not being trapped.
It's not a quick fix, that's for sure. But Krishnamurti suggests we need to start by seeing thought for what it is, a tool, a process.
A tool.
Yeah, think about it. Thought is incredibly useful for practical things like how to get to work, how to bake a cake, all that stuff.
Right, the everyday stuff.
Exactly. But it's when we get caught up in our thoughts, when we believe everything they tell us, that's when the trouble starts.
So it's like our thoughts are these little storytellers always spinning yarns in our minds, and we get so lost in those stories that we forget they're just made up.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
We start to believe the stories, and then we react to them as if they were real. And a lot of times those stories are based in fear.
So what's the alternative? If we can't always trust our thoughts, what do we rely on?
Krishnamurti suggests we need to become the observer of our thoughts, rather than being controlled by them.
That sounds tricky. How do you just observe your thoughts without getting swept away by them?
It takes practice, but it starts with awareness. Noticing when your mind is racing, when you're getting caught up in worries or anxieties.
It's like hitting the pause button on the thought train.
Exactly. And once you've paused, you can choose how to respond. You don't have to believe every thought that pops into your head.
So we have more control than we think we do.
We do. We just have to learn how to use that control.
Yeah.
Krishnamurti even asks this question: can thought realize its own limitations?
Wow. That's a deep one. So it's like, can thought understand that it's not the be-all and end-all, that there's something beyond thought?
That's the idea.
Mm-hmm.
And when we can see thought for what it is, a process, a tool, then we're no longer trapped by it. We have a choice.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this connects to everything else we've been talking about. The illusion of the me, the fear that arises from that illusion, and how thought plays a role in all of it.
It's all interconnected, isn't it? And when we start to see those connections, that's when real transformation can happen.
And that brings me back to something we touched on earlier, Krishnamurti's emphasis on perception. He seems to be saying that if we can learn to see clearly, without all the filters of thought and judgment, then we can break free from these cycles of fear.
Precisely. It's about seeing things as they are, not as we want them to be, or as we fear they might be.
But how do we cultivate that kind of clear seeing? How do we learn to perceive the world without all the baggage?
It starts with observation, but a particular kind of observation. One that's free from judgment, analysis, or the desire to change what we're seeing.
So just being present with what is, without trying to fix it or make it different.
Exactly. Just noticing your thoughts, your feelings, your sensations without labeling them as good or bad, right or wrong.
You know, as we've been talking, I've noticed a shift in myself. It's subtle, but I do feel a little calmer, a little more spacious somehow.
That's the power of this kind of observation. It creates space. It allows us to step back from the constant chatter of the mind and just be.
And is that what Krishnamurti's pointing to, this state of just being?
He is. And he suggests that as we develop this ability to observe without judgment, something really remarkable happens. That sense of a separate me, that solid, unchanging self we often cling to, it begins to dissolve.
It's like we're loosening the grip on that fixed sense of self. And as we do that, maybe the fear starts to loosen its grip too.
That's exactly what Krishnamurti teaches. As that sense of me fades, so does the fear. Because fear is often rooted in that sense of separation, in that belief that we're this isolated self that needs to protect itself from the world.
So if there's no separate self to defend, what's left to be afraid of? It's a mind-bending idea, but does this mean that fear can actually dissolve completely?
It's not that fear disappears entirely. We're still human. We still have instincts and emotions. But fear no longer controls us. We're not reacting from that place of fear anymore. We're responding from a place of clarity, compassion, and understanding.
And that's what Krishnamurti means by right action, right? Acting from a place of freedom, not from the compulsion of fear.
Exactly. It's about responding to life's challenges with intelligence, sensitivity, and a deep understanding of our interconnectedness with all things.
It's a pretty radical shift in perspective, isn't it? To move from a place of fear and separation to a place of love and connection. It's a lot to take in, but I think it's worth exploring.
It is. And that's what Krishnamurti invites us to do, to keep exploring, to keep questioning, to keep diving deep into these questions about who we are and how we want to live in the world.
That's all for our deep dive today, but we hope it's given you some food for thought. What resonated with you? What are you still grappling with? Keep those questions alive. And until next time, happy exploring.